welcome to a very special year-end edition of Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific? It is I, in my Charlie Brown Christmas tie, a festive Californian. It is you, Jim Carouso, a not-so-festive Arizonan. Where is your cheer?
You're wearing the tie. That's really enough for everybody.
Look, I mean, you can't go wrong with Snoopy. Snoopy is for all seasons, but especially when you've got the tree with him. So how is Christmas in the desert? How do you deck the halls?
Carefully, given all the cactus. Actually, we bought a tree.
Yeah,
we had family coming down with a 2.5-year-old, so we're waiting for her to help decorate. And it'll be like Christmas everywhere else except warm.
Well, we've got family in town as well. We've got the kids here. But our listeners didn't tune in for that, even though I'm sure that they love to hear that we're decking the halls. In the meantime, we want to announce that we have a sponsor coming on board. We will talk a little bit more about them later, but just to kind of let everyone know that as Bauer Group Asia has graciously agreed to sponsor this podcast, and hopefully that'll help bring us to a lot more people.
Indeed. Well, so full disclosure, I am a senior advisor at Bauer Group and was managing director of the Singapore office for a while. So I have a long relationship with them. But I joined them after leaving the Foreign Service because they are very professional, know the region well. They have offices in literally every country in the Indo-Pacific, staffed almost exclusively by local folks who know what's happening on the ground. So we talked to some of their experts. We've had some of them on. And they're good value. So
yep,
I feel
absolutely. This is a great marriage. We sought it out, and they saw the same value as we did. And so we're really excited they'll help us reach a lot more people. By the way, just for Bauer Groups, for when you're listening, this is gratis because we'll probably be releasing this before the first of the year, which is the start of our relationship. So we're just saying this because we love you, our sponsor. All right.
As the negotiations start all over again.
Exactly. So anyway, all that is to say, this is our year-end edition, and we're going to look back on 2024 and ahead to the next year to see what's coming up. And we're going to start with this question for you, Jim Carouso. In your mind, what was the most significant Indo-Pacific development of 2024 that you have been following?
Well, there's a lot to choose from, but since I'm the econ geek, I think the problems in the Chinese economy after so many years of really excellent growth, whether you believe the numbers or not. And suddenly it all comes not to a halt, but a lot of people now are pretty unhappy. They've lost their savings in stock market fall, in real estate. And the reaction by the government has not been to stimulate the economy, is to double down on exports.
Yeah.
When already we have a problem with a lot of countries saying we can't handle any more of your exports.
Yeah.
And President Xi doubling down on state control.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the more cowbell problem, right? I mean, it's, when that is the state ideology, that's your go-to. I mean, how do you, it is liberalization is simply not in his DNA, and certainly hasn't been in his political DNA since the beginning of his time in office. And so, and I mean, it's going in parallel with, of course, what we've seen is this continuous anti-corruption campaign. Again, who these people are who are being weeded out and what their exact sins are is very unclear. But it seems to be an effort by President Xi to consolidate power, and that kind of authoritarianism over time doesn't tend to wear well on economies.
Absolutely. We mentioned it before, but Kevin Rudd, current ambassador to the U.S. from Australia, wrote a really excellent book about the agglomeration of power, not within the state, but within the Communist Party, and especially in the person of President Xi, and how this has come about and what it means. So we have that, and now we have President Trump, who has also now got basic control over at least 2, maybe 3 branches of the U.S. government. He's staffing his administration with a lot of people who are personally loyal to him. So these 2 persons of incredible power are going to come together and make 2025 especially fascinating.
Well, of course, the fact is that this is not their first time to be on the world stage together. And so what we're trying to figure out is what is this version of President Trump, and frankly, the 2025 version of President Xi, how do they interact? Because it's not going to be the same necessarily, although we can take some cues. For my significant development, I'm going to kind of riff off of the Xi Jinping consolidation of power and maybe his outward aggression to talk about all of the coming together we've seen especially in the UN's alliance network. We've seen these trilaterals, U.S, Japan, Korea, was really significant. U.S, Japan, Philippines. We've seen all of these multilateral naval operations that have happened in the South China Sea with mostly U.S. and its allies, whether they be regional allies or NATO allies. So we've seen this hardening of exactly the thing that China says that it most wants to avoid, which is kind of an anti-China bloc. And I think that has really, and again, China has caused this to a large degree because of the level of its aggressions against its neighbors, and not just its neighbors, but places as far away as Europe.
Indeed. The Biden administration helping broker a rapprochement between South Korea and Japan was pretty huge. Now we have to see if that lasts, given activities in South Korea for sure.
We may talk more about that in a little while.
Yeah, and as well as elections in Japan that changed the power structure there a bit.
And of course, all of this military activity around Taiwan has sort of galvanized everyone's attention to the fact that military hostilities are not as far away as we would wish they would be, right? I mean, it's certainly by no means a certainty, but we have to come to terms with the fact that it's certainly a plausibility, and having a plausibility of a potential confrontation between two nuclear powers, the U.S. and China, is a scary thought.
Like a hanging, it focuses the mind.
Yes.
And we've had a lot of guests on from the very beginning who've talked about this potential and the problems. So I'll ask you, does Trump make a grand deal with Xi of some sort to avert this problem?
I mean, I think, of course, he always has that inclination, right? He's always looking out for the grand deal. Of course, we saw in the first term, we saw all of the dancing around the North Korea problem and just, thinking that if he could just get little Rocket Man into a room, that they could come up with something. And it just turns out that the devil really is in the details. And at some point, Xi is going to want some things that he's not going to want to give up. So, actually, if there was naturally a grand deal to be had, one would think that somebody would have found it already. But the direction of China has not taken them in the direction of a grand deal. And I don't think that, the people that Trump is potentially surrounding himself with in his this rolling announcement of these cabinet appointments, they're not exactly a bunch of sort of the kind of people you'd expect to sell all their allies and partners down the river in the search of a grand deal.
Well, they're certainly not China doves, except for one, and that's Elon Musk.
Well, yes. Well, we're not talking about the first buddy here. As far as I know, that's not yet a cabinet position. But yes, no, I agree with you. And it probably does actually deserve a mention.
Well, I think so. And this is going to be, again, a different sort of administration. He's naming special envoys for all these regions and for different issues that report directly to, I guess, the president.
Yeah.
Bypassing state, bypassing defense. How will this operate?
Yeah.
Are we going to have this supra White House that's running all these policies?
Well, and then, meanwhile, you can't really make necessarily the kind of grand deal that he might want to make without the participation of Congress. And Congress has not been going in that direction, right? I mean, the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party has been almost certainly the busiest part of Congress over the last several years. It's churning out all kinds of legislation, and they are not feeling a deal, I don't think. I think that they are moving in quite the opposite direction.
Well, I guess it would depend on the deal and depend how much control Donald Trump truly has over his members of the Republican Party.
And I mean, so we learned a lot about how Donald Trump operates in his national security space, I think, from H.R. McMaster when we had him on a few weeks ago. He actually does end up taking a lot of input from a lot of places. Now, again, there is a sense that it's all kind of chaotic, and you're not sure if it's it's going to be the last person who comes in and who's got his ear at any given time. But according to HR, I mean, he does listen and he does learn, and people can convince him, even if it runs counter to his impulse. They can convince him to take a second thought. You can look back even to say, going into that last year, he was the one who had talked about getting out of Afghanistan come hell or high water for quite a long time, and was frankly dissuaded from doing so just because of the risks involved. And so now, of course, that ended up happening under Joe Biden.
Well, but he cut the deal with the Taliban.
He did, yeah. So he laid the groundwork for sure. But anyway, it is to say that he does take a lot of input, and he will have a lot of people around him who are going to give him some quite contrary advice. But I want to keep this kind of rolling along, and I want to ask you, as far as Indo-Pacific developments, what particularly surprised you? Do you have a surprise development of 2024 that kind of stands out to you?
Well, for me, for sure, it was the coup, whatever it was, in South Korea. I don't think people saw that coming. I sure didn't.
Yeah. That one got our attention to the point where, of course, we had to reach out to Lieutenant General Chun and ask him to come on for an emergency podcast. First and only one we've ever done, because we were trying to figure out what in the world was going on.
Yeah, what's interesting is clearly he was surprised too.
Yeah.
Which is sort of reassuring.
Our one return guest that we've had so far. We're going to have people back, but yeah, no, we were happy to be able to get him on, especially given the role, of course, in the military in a martial law situation. It was really valuable to have him on and kind of give us his perspective.
Right, and I guess the question is, with all the anti-incumbency feeling out there in democracies, frankly, a growing dissatisfaction among electorates with our democracies, was this a symptom of that? President Yoon thought he could get away with it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly was an extremely poorly planned event, but maybe unplanned. I don't know if it was just sort of spur of the moment he decided to do this. As General Chun said, they thought they were turning on the TV that night to watch an economic speech.
That's amazing.
So
it was the biggest surprise to you?
I have kind of a bias around I focus a lot of my attention around the South China Sea, and I'm going to say, China basically locking down Sabina Shoal was surprising to me. And that unfolded, of course, in a very unusual way. And just to kind of orient our listeners, Sabina Shoal is sort of to the east of Second Thomas Shoal, which is where all of the excitement has been up until now around that rusty ship out there where the resupplies have been happening. And that situation was kind of being worked out. They were working out a deal between China and the Philippines so they could avoid some of these really extreme situations we saw during the year. And then all of a sudden in April, the Philippines sends a ship out to Sabina Shoal and drops anchor and essentially says, okay, we're going to be here for a while. And China freaked out. I mean, they really sort of, I think, went off the deep end a little over this. They called it a quasi-grounding, sort of equating it to, in fact, I kept talking about what happens when they ground this ship, as if the Philippines was going to ground one of their very newest, largest Coast Guard ships. It was not an old World War II vessel like the Sierra Madre out at Second Thomas Shoal. But I mean, the rhetoric just kept climbing and climbing. And I think to some degree, China talked itself into the fact that it could not, after this was over, allow any Philippine ships back into Sabina Shoal. And Sabina Shoal is in some ways unlike Second Thomas Shoal. Of course, it doesn't have a grounded ship there, but it's a very large, scattered group. It's not even a shoal like a single shoal. It's a whole bunch of reefs all just kind of in the same geographical area. And so locking that place down or just keeping all the Philippine ships out of it is not an easy task. It's actually quite difficult. And so, I'm not sure that had they gone back into their little rooms to plan all this, that they would have planned it this way. And yet here we are.
It doesn't bode well for 2025 if this is how it's going. And it concerns me that there'll be another surprise of the same sort next year.
Yeah, well, so now, I mean, again, this is like China's now the dog that caught the car, right? Because they do now sort of own it. They've taken it. They made it clear that the Philippine ships are not allowed in, and now they're going to have to keep patrolling it for. And so again, I began this year to refer to this after this event. I began to refer to it as a maritime occupation because the amount of water that China is now trying to control is really grown quite large, and all there in the West Philippine Sea and the Philippines exclusive economic zone. And I have said that I think that the Philippines is going to have to start thinking in these terms as that they are under sort of a maritime occupation, because that's going to inform how they go about figuring out what to do about it. What do you do when you have an imperial occupier coming in from the outside? And of course, the fact that I'm using these terms has drawn some attention from some of my friends in Beijing, and I'm now hearing about that more and more. But it's not just because I'm being anti-China. I really think that this is, from a strategic perspective, this is the way that the Philippines needs to start thinking about their problem.
Well, the Philippines, frankly, needs to do a better job with its ASEAN neighbors and allies. When newly elected President Prabowo of Indonesia on his first trip goes and cuts a deal with China to co-develop resources in the South China Sea under Indonesian control. Now the word about what's going on with Sabina Shoal or anything else with the Philippines, it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, that is, of course, this has been the problem for a while. Right now, it's grown into sort of this stark importance because of what we've seen over the last 2 years and the escalation of tensions between the Philippines and China. But this growing chasm between the rest of the ASEANs, if you will, and the Philippines is a real concern. It has to be a real concern for ASEAN, right? Because ASEAN doesn't seem to have a way to deal with this, right? They are a consensus-based organization. They're not really built for this kind of an external security threat. Certainly not one that comes in and it kind of has the kind of economic clout that China does to basically pry people apart or the nations apart. So there's no playbook for ASEAN to follow. And I'd be worried if I were ASEAN. How much does this undermine my credibility if they don't know what to do about this?
There are already reports that Prabowo is turning away from ASEAN as he doesn't want to go to all the boring meetings.
Yeah, I will say one of my favorite moments last year is when we were interviewing Prasanth Parmaswan talking about ASEAN, and we were talking about the old saying that ASEAN is a cow, not a horse. And you chimed in, yeah, but ASEAN keeps neighing. So that was one of those things that I'll take with me.
We'll try and do better for next year.
All right, let's talk about some of our hits. So just to kind of set the stage, we had several podcasts. Now, of course, when we make these podcasts, some of our audience is watching us on YouTube. Others are watching on or listening on their podcast service, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or one of those. And different kinds of podcasts do differently on different platforms. And so video podcasts tend to be more, they tend to go viral more in Asia. People are more YouTube kind of people in Asia, whereas people in the West oftentimes are more audio podcasts for whatever reason. And so it's a different list depending on which platform. And so on YouTube, by a large margin, our podcast with Atul Keshup, Why Should We Care If India Becomes the World's Third Largest Economy, was our winner. And apparently we went quite viral in India, which as a nation of 1.4 billion people, you can see how that would benefit that particular episode. But then after that, we had one on why should we care if China is harassing Philippine ships. We were just talking about that with Commodore Jay Tariella. And then the third place was Why Should We Care? Once again, India. Why should we care about India's strategic ambiguity with James Crabtree? So now on the audio side, we had our number one performer was Mick Ryan and Mike Studeman. Our episode 7, Why Should We Care About the Defense of Taiwan? And then again, Taiwan, episode 14 with Admiral Phil Davidson. Why should we care about Taiwan's Davidson window? And then finally, our third place on the audio side was our pilot podcast, where it was just you and I launching this program. Why should we care about the Indo-Pacific? So I'm going to give you those 6, or I'm going to let you pick off the board if you want. Which was your favorite, which one jumps to your mind as being kind of the one that really stands out?
Well, Studeman and Ryan were really good.
Yeah.
Because it was interesting perspective from the military guy and the civilian guy, and who really know the issue.
Yeah.
So that's one for sure. Given our Australia background, I thought our discussion with former Prime Minister Turnbull and his actual dealings with Trump, what actually happened in the room, was interesting. And frankly, I was surprised it didn't get more.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you, and in fact, it came up early, but I was going to ask you whether that would be your most underrated podcast of 2024, because that was something we were going to talk about later, but that would certainly be a qualifier.
For me, he's very well spoken. He had some
very direct,
blunt things that politicians don't usually say.
Yes.
So I thought that was pretty interesting. And then our conversation with Elbridge Colby, who is now named Undersecretary for Policy at Defense Department. I thought that was really interesting too. Again, he said some controversial things.
And very useful for the reason you just mentioned, because as you said, and that was episode 11, I believe. And we framed it, why should we care about America's defense priorities? Because the way that he frames the problem, he basically almost cedes the issue that Americans don't want to spend more on defense. So we're going to have to make hard decisions to prioritize what we're spending on, and specifically spending on the Indo-Pacific at the expense of other theaters. And that, I think, is where he gets most of the pushback. And of course, you and I expressed some concerns about that as well, because of course we connect things, I think, a lot more than he does. We tend to say what happens in Ukraine has fallout effects in Taiwan, whereas he tends to dismiss that, I think, a little bit more.
Well, this brings up the next question of what surprises we're going to have for next year a bit. And to me, it's into procurement and what our militaries are spending money on. If we learn nothing else from Ukraine, it is war has changed.
Yeah. So that sort of relates to this question of now. So a second Trump administration, at least Donald Trump himself has been here before. He's going to have definite ideas of what he wants to do. But of course, he's also bringing in people who, at least some of their calling cards is they're willing to break things, to get to some other stake. And so, it is true. And again, not every time you break something is the outcome what you expected. But it is true that there's a lot about our military procurement system, and specifically, people look, and we talked to Elbridge about this. We look at our defense industrial base, and anyone who looks at it for more than about 3 seconds is alarmed that we are not in a position where we could sustain ourselves over a serious, international conflict, much less an all-out war with the People's Republic of China, God forbid, right? And so, something has to happen. Something does have to give. And so, one of the things we talked about with him was the defense industrial base, right? And whether or not we need to actually sort of promote that in our list of priorities. And he basically said, absolutely. And that's one of his priorities.
Well, about a year ago, you and I were at a event up at Stanford.
Yep.
And one of the principals of one of the young new defense-oriented companies talked about how absurd he found it that companies that make jet engines are also writing software to run the plane when they don't have that sort of deep knowledge of software and systems that Silicon Valley does.
Yeah.
So, and with the people that Trump is hiring now, a lot of Silicon Valley types. So are we going to see a major change in procurement?
Yeah, that'll be a big thing to watch. I agree with you. And of course, along those same lines, we talked about Silicon Valley. We had there in episode 24, we had with Anshu Roy from Rhombus talking about whether AI is going to be able to predict future crises. And, what he asserted was we're already doing it. It's happening now. how does that change the landscape? I'd love to hear him come back and talk about what they're able to predict in Syria, because of course that was something that caught everyone by surprise. Will we get to the point where nothing catches us by surprise, where the sort of the strategic surprise in the way that we used to think about it starts to go away, and then how does that affect everything?
Well, and the question of autonomous weapons, not resolved in international agreements. While the technology is advancing apace, again, as we've seen Ukraine, where now land vehicles are operating on their own, I gather, swarms of drones operating. We need our military leaders to really wrestle with this and decide how we manage procurement and tactics.
And do our adversaries get out ahead of us on this, to the point where, this could be a real, if we did it right and quickly and were able to leverage our natural penchant toward innovation as a capitalist society, could we sort of turn the tables in places like East Asia, the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, by giving an aggressor state more to think about? But right now they think, okay, we know where their carrier groups are. We know how to hit them with our land-based missiles. They're developing drone capabilities. But what we need to be able to do is deter them and assure our allies that they're deterrable, so that some of those don't start making business decisions and saying, okay, we just got to make the best deal we can with China while the deal is still something that we can choke down. This is actually really key. We need to be able to, if this revolution is coming, we need to be the ones in front of it, not the ones trying to catch up.
Again, what we've learned in Ukraine is tanks seem to be yesterday's piece of weaponry.
Yeah.
Infantry maneuvering seems to be dead.
Yep.
So if that's the case on land, is it similar in sea?
So yeah, and certainly maybe dead is a little overstated, but gasping for breath, so certainly
be happy.
Yeah. I would say that my favorite episode of 2024, I have to go to the one that I did in person out there in the Philippines with Senator Risa Haltaveras. And it wasn't just because she was a great guest, and she was, but the topic was so interesting. This whole idea of, so this was episode 19, and we talked about China's criminal gaming syndicates and how these had proliferated not just across the Philippines, but in this case across the Philippines, and become hubs of all kinds of stuff, including potentially, it seems like, espionage. And what made that such a seminal interview was that in the wake of that, not only did President Marcos then declare all of these Philippine offshore gaming organizations, or POGOs, declare them all illegal, and begin to shut them all down, but we began to learn all kinds of things that the mayor of a small town that she talked about, who kind of started the entire discussion, turned out to have been almost certainly, certainly she was not born in the Philippines. She was certainly born abroad in China had a Chinese passport. But there's substantial evidence that she was actually an if not an agent, but at least an asset of the Ministry of State Security. That things have come out. So just such a fascinating interview from people who are really on the front lines trying to fight it.
And who knows what other crazy things we're going to discover next year.
Yes, exactly. All right, Jim. Your person of the year for 2024, Indo-Pacific person of the year. The board is open. Pick anyone.
Well, when Time Magazine named Trump person of the year, and Financial Times did the same.
Yeah, you can be boring.
Yeah, and it's boring. So I get it. But we are going to do Asia Pacific. The problem is I'm still boring, and I think it's Xi.
Yeah.
Because he has proceeded to ride through the economic storms, consolidated his power, as we discussed, created this axis of baddies.
Yep.
With Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
Yep.
While having almost no pushback from the West. That's pretty good.
Yeah. I think it depends on how high your standard is for pushback, right? So I think that there has been pushback, and it's more like sort of this gathering pushback, sort of, again, I would say a general hardening of positions as people have realized that this is a real problem, and that the age of trying to figure out an accommodation with China that's going to be favorable to Western markets or to international markets or to or to just any kind of view of what we used to call the rules-based order. I think we still do. That doesn't make a huge exception for whatever Xi Jinping decides belongs to China. Is going to be really, really hard to get for as long as he's around. I'm going to throw out two names we've already mentioned. One would be President Yoon up there in South Korea, and the other would be President Marcos in the Philippines. In both cases, because they've both been involved in huge geopolitical machinations, as well as navigating these huge domestic circumstances. So in President Yoon's case, of course, that trilateral we talked about, and the rapprochement with Japan is really significant, but we don't know how much longer he's going to be around, because on the domestic side, he went out and declared martial law, and now he's being impeached. So yeah, and we do know that his opposition has had much lower opinion of the Japan relationship than he has. So how does this go forward? So he could have been the man of the year for all the right reasons, or the person of the year for all the right reasons, and now he's come out in sort of this netherworld. We're not really sure where this is going. And then on Marco's side, he again has he's become a leading voice on the international law, the rules-based order, all of these things that we value in East Asia and in the Indo-Pacific. I mean, he was the keynote speaker at the Shangri-La Dialogue, which is a big deal. Making all of these points, he's become an extremely important international figure. And meanwhile, at home, he is locked in a death match with the Duterte family of, for the former President Duterte and the vice president, whose name is also Duterte. And they're going at it hammer and tongs, and we really don't know where this is going to end out. Now, he doesn't come up, the end of his term he's term limited one term. The end of his term doesn't come up till 2028, but they've got a midterm coming up this upcoming year, and we don't, how that goes is going to have a lot to do with how things move forward, and whether or not, the Duterte name remains very popular across a lot of the Philippines. We don't know how that's going to come out.
Yep, there's a lot of uncertainty all around. In our old stomping ground, Australia, they're going to have elections probably in our northern spring.
Yep.
Good likelihood of a minority government or some sort of coalition. What is that going to mean for things like AUKUS?
Yeah, well, and of course, AUKUS has got detractors everywhere, including in our own country. So it's got a lot of hurdles you have to climb over, and we had a couple of really good AUKUS podcasts as well. All right, Jim, let's lighten the mood a little bit. What have you enjoyed most about podcasting since we started our little adventure, our little podventure back in April? What stands out to you as the things that you really got the most out of?
No, it's funny. I was thinking about this, and it occurs to me that in our old jobs as diplomats, it was to go out and talk to people and try and understand their point of view and ask them questions to better help us formulate arguments for pushing the U.S. point of view. Yep. But the first thing always was, let's hear what they have to say and understand their point of view. Now we get to do that, and we don't have to push anything. That's right. You just get to listen, ask questions. No writing up notes afterwards. Send the cable back to D.C. So it's the good bits of diplomacy.
Yeah. I certainly all of that. I also want to say, so first of all, I've long loved the idea of podcasting. I played with the idea for a long period of time. And, when I sort of settled on the idea that this is something I wanted to do, I thought to myself, I don't want to do this by myself. And eventually I only came up with one name of a person I wanted to do it with, and it was you. And
I thought you were going to say someone else.
Yeah, but he wasn't available. So No, I mean, so doing this with you, and since we're talking about it, I want to say as a pleasant surprise, our podcast producer, Ian Ellis Jones, came kind of out of nowhere and said, "Hey, I'd love to do that for you," and that has been such a huge deal for us. I mean, when we can sort of concentrate on this, on sort of the interaction, on getting the guests, all those kinds of things, and he's working on all that stuff on the back end, that he does the magic that makes us look amazing, or at least as close to amazing as I'm able to look.
For yourself.
So that one came out of nowhere. It was a huge surprise. Another thing I'll mention is as something that I've really enjoyed is I've enjoyed the number of people I've run into who've said, "Oh yeah, and I love your podcast," because it's what you can when you see numbers come back and you say, "Okay, we're gaining listeners here, and a bunch of people in India just watched this," or whatever. That's fun, but it's pretty impersonal. But it's when the people say to you, and especially when they go, "I really like the one you did with so and so," right? They're really sort of, now maybe they're just being polite. They only listened to one and they thought that's the one they should mention, but it's still fun.
Yeah, no, I have a similar experience, and it's frankly, I'm always surprised, but it is heartening. But we were discussing how
I got to tell you a quick story about that. So I was recently in Manila for the Manila Dialogue in the South China Sea, and there's a young, I mean, he looks really young to me. Of course, maybe that just means I'm getting old. Vietnamese. I think he's like an intern with Pacific Forum, and he came. I won't mention his name because I don't have permission, but he came up to me, sort of up right behind me. I was sitting there. I got the placard on my desk that says who I am, and he says, "Ray Powell," and I turned around and he says, "Why should we care about the Indo-Pacific?" And then he went on to tell me that he listened to all of our episodes. And it was just so much fun. He was, again, this just right out of nowhere. He's way out of my natural demographic. But by probably 4 decades, but okay, maybe 3, but it's such a pleasant surprise when that happens. I just wanted to throw that one. I thought
that's great. So we were discussing how we get our audience to have more interaction, get us ideas for what we should talk about or people to talk about. Praise,
yeah,
the opposite of praise.
I look, you look. Okay. I'll tell you what, let's get to that in a second. First, I want to ask you just a couple more questions. One is, what's your biggest lesson learned in however many months, 9 months of podcasting now? What's the biggest thing you take away as a lesson learned?
Boy, lesson learned. That this is easier than I thought, but it has a lot of room for improvement.
I'll say YouTube algorithms. I learned a lot about algorithms on YouTube and how, you never know when something is going to go viral and all. And again, viral in our terms is different, perhaps, than viral in Elon Musk's terms, right? But, when all of a sudden a podcast episode is just going to take off. And the one that I'll mention specifically was the one we did with you and Graham and on Malaysia. Got a lot more attention than a lot of the other ones that we've done, just sort of kind of out of nowhere, right? I mean, I have not spent a lot of time cultivating a following in Malaysia. I don't, you haven't worked in Malaysia. And, Yoon himself, hasn't spent a ton of time in Malaysia as far as, the places that he's been. But sometimes, it just catches on for reasons you can't really explain. And of course, a lot of the comments you get are like, "Well, we don't care about you either." So sometimes you get things that, people don't really actually watch it. They just sort of react to the title. But a lot of people did. They listened through the whole thing and they had very thoughtful comments, and it was really interesting. So that's one of the things that I learned. Last question for you. As you think about our podcasting adventure, what are you looking forward to in 2025? What are you excited about?
Well, because it's going to be no doubt a really interesting year, getting people on to help us understand what's happening, looking ahead, and I won't say debating with them, but trying to get to the nub of where things are going and what we can do about it. It helps me feel like I'm still have some aspect of relevance.
Yeah. Well, and I think, some of the guests that we've had on up until now, again, so many of them have been so good, and some of them have some pretty big names. And, people like Malcolm Turnbull or H.R. McMaster or Admiral Phil Davidson or Harry Harris. These kinds of heavy hitters have started to clear the way for us to get even more of those kinds of people, which will be really good to sort of get that senior level or just the recognized expert level kinds of contributions. So I think that's great. And of course, our sponsorship, having a deal with Bauer Group Asia, will help us get the word out to a lot more people, which I think will be helpful for us. It'll also, we talked about algorithms, and I'll just mention, for our listeners, please do subscribe. Subscriptions matter, and they matter for us in terms of those algorithms, right? It's going to suggest it to a lot more people if you subscribe on your YouTube channel or on your Spotify feed. It matters, and we think that this is an important topic, and we care clearly about the Indo-Pacific. We want other people to care. We want other people to get this content and begin to sort of tune in to what's happening to what we think is the world's most interesting and important theater going forward. So, all right. So your question, how can people reach us? We do have now, finally, for those who've been clamoring for it, an email address. People can email questions or recommendations to. It's Indo-Pacific Podcast, all one word, Indo-Pacific Podcast @gmail.com. Go ahead and send us email there if you've got something you'd like us to talk about, a guest that you think we really ought to have. We can't have them all. We've had a lot of really interesting people recommended to it, and it's just a matter of, trying to get the ones scheduled who are the most timely and important for the things that we're looking at right now. But you know what? We've had some people recommended to us that we have followed up on. We've actually had on the program. And by the way, I won't tip the name, Jim, but our next guest, I think, is going to be somebody that's really well placed and exciting, and a person to talk about, in particular, U.S.-Japan relations. So I'm looking forward to our next one.
Indeed.
All right. So that brings us to the closeout of our 2024 content. We're looking forward to seeing all of you in 2025. Again, if you do listen to the podcast, go ahead and reach out to us. As you know, by listening to this one, we do really like hearing from you, and we think it's really fun when you tell us that you listen and what you like. A shout out once again to our awesome producer, Ian Ellis Jones. If you don't follow him on X, @Ian Ellis Jones, one word, you should be, because he is a person. We keep seeing his graphics at the most unusual places. People will basically steal it from him, but he doesn't mind as long as his name is on it and gets the credit he deserves. But you should be following him on X. And of course, if you're watching and you want to listen instead, look us up on your favorite YouTube, or not YouTube, your favorite audio podcast channel. Why should we care about the Indo-Pacific? On the other hand, if you're listening and you want to watch, it's youtube.com @IP-podcast. Finally, X @Indo-Pacific Podcast, Indo-Pac Podcast. You get a lot of things to remember. And you can also follow us on LinkedIn. All right, Jim Carouso, happy holidays. Great to see you. Merry Christmas from Charlie Brown and Snoopy.
All right. Well, it's been a fun 24. Looking forward to even more than 25. And now that we have a sponsor, Ian doesn't have to eat beans for dinner every night.
All right. And we look forward to talking to you all again on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific?